I'm Jeffrey Rickman. This is Plain Spoken. This is a podcast aimed at having meaningful conversations in the current cultural moment for the local church. I'm a Methodist. I'm a global Methodist elder. I serve a local church. I'm selfishly interested in speaking to those things that impact my people, but also more broadly, my denomination is new and we're needing to figure out who we are. We largely were a response against far leftism becoming dominant within the United Methodist Church, and that's seen in a number of ways. But the Global Methodist Church has yet to articulate any kind of systematic theology on gender and sexuality. We find ourselves in the midst of a culture that's very confused about these things, whether or not our bodies in their gendered or sexed expressions are images of the Imago Dei, whether these things are negotiable, whether these things are subjective and located in the individual, or if they're objective and not subject to revision. Specifically, what I'm talking about is trans ideology. And a lot of us are very familiar, at least on the front end, with people who are up in arms about biological men trying to behave like women and have drag queen story hours or go into women's spaces or play in women's sports. But something else that has kind of been seeping into our awareness, Abigail Schreier started writing about this a few years ago, particularly in a book called Irreversible Damage. A lot of young women are catching this ideology as a social contagion, especially autistic young women, and going through irreversible hormonal and physiological augmentation in order to conform with a very disjointed sense of self. This is something that impacts the local church. I'm not going to pretend to have a ton of on-the-ground experience. What I am going to say is I talk with pastors all over the country that are dealing with strange stuff like this on the front lines. This is not a time where we can stick our heads in the sand and act like it's not happening. Rather, we need to think through these things critically, maturely, proactively, because we do need to have something to offer whenever families that are very much enthralled with this stuff come to us. What is the authentic Christian worldview as it pertains to sexuality and gender ideology, all of this stuff? What is a compassionate response, but what is a faithful response? January Littlejohn is the guest today. She was personally impacted by this. Her daughter was very much affected by this, and January has told her and her family's story on a few podcasts. She's been acknowledged by the Trump administration as a very helpful voice in the midst of all of this. I've spent just all cards on the table. I've spent about 30, 45 minutes watching her, doing what I can to learn about the story. But the next hour is going to be her equipping you and your church to deal with these issues. She's going to tell her story, the different issues at play. She's also a licensed clinical therapist. She knows the theory involved here, the professional life, and then she's involved in a lawsuit against the school system that had a role to play in the dysfunction there. So I think that's all I can safely say right now. This is January Littlejohn. Thank you, Miss Littlejohn, for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm very glad to host you. You and I were connected by Deborah, whose last name I'm always forgetting, but I've already talked to her about. She used to be a same-sex attracted person, and now she has been freed from that by the power of Jesus, and we've had some wonderful conversations. What we're talking about today is not the same thing. It's related, though. There's a lot of confusion today around sexual identity and behavior and all this. How do you think is helpful for us to lay the groundwork for people to start grappling with these issues?
Sure. I think it's probably just appropriate for us to start where this started for my family back in 2020.
Please do.
Great. So, at the height of COVID, this would have been May of 2020. Our daughter was 13 at the time, and she came to my husband and me and told us she no longer felt like a girl. And so, this announcement came shortly after three of her other friends at her in person friend group at our local middle school had also suddenly started identifying as transgender. And I use that word very loosely. I typically use the term trans identified because today, transgender, that term, has no coherent meaning. I
Mm.
am a licensed mental health counselor. And so when I was trained clinically in the late 90s, When you typically thought of gender distress or distress over one sex, it started in early childhood. It impacted mostly males. And it was very, very, but what I was seeing with my daughter and her friend group was not at all similar in any way, shape, or form to how I was trained. And so you have to understand that at the time when this happened to our family, very little was known. The world was up in chaos, schools were shut down, and a lot of adolescents, including my daughter, were experiencing anxiety as a result of those shutdowns. And so I knew something didn't feel right. And so we did elicit the help of a licensed counselor to help my husband and I navigate what was happening with our daughter. Because leading up to this, Jeff, she had no confusion over her sex, no signs of distress. She was a quirky, normal adolescent. And I think it's really important for your audience to understand that gender identity ideology, it teaches these children they have so-called a gender identity that's completely separate from their sex, and they choose to be a boy, girl, neither or both. And at the
Mhm.
time of my daughter's distress, she had told us that she was identifying as what's called non-binary, meaning she didn't feel like she was a boy or a girl. She was somewhere in between. But when you really start to break this down and ask questions, you quickly realize this is all very related to archaic gender stereotypes. So, what my daughter was actually saying was because I don't fit a hyper feminine version of what it means to be a girl, therefore I must not be a girl. And so, we'll unpack other reasons why she fell prey to this specific ideology, which to me is a house of cards built on multiple lies. But where this took our family, it took a drastic turn in the fall of 2020 when she went back to school. Unlike a lot of places in the country, we were given the option of going back to school in person, but it was very locked down. Parents were not allowed on campus. The children all had to wear masks in order to go to school. But we were at least hopeful that providing that structure again for her, because she's also diagnosed ADHD, getting back into a routine, being around people again, we were hoping that this would all help other issues that she was experiencing. But also during that summer, Jeff, like many of these adolescents falling prey to this ideology, things were starting to escalate. And so she was quickly asking to go by a different name and different pronouns.
She was asking
She was
you?
asked, yes,
Okay.
she was asking my husband and I to call her by a different name, which we declined. She was asking to use they, them pronouns, which I had never even heard of. That made no sense to me because, again, trained clinically in this, the word non binary was non existent. And I
Mhm.
worked predominantly with adolescents and young adults on college campuses. And so if this were a thing back then, I would have seen it. I did not have one client that was having any kind of confusion over their sex. So when school started, we naively assumed that it would be treated as a nickname. We were very clear with the school that we were not affirming the name at home, that we were concerned about our daughter's mental health because it was spiraling. By this time, she was asking for things that I had never heard of, like breast binders. She was cavalierly talking about a euphemism called top surgery, which is really a double mastectomy.
Mhm.
And so we were very concerned about where this was taking daughter, and we were confused how this was all happening so quickly. Abigail Schreier's book that you referenced, Irreversible Damage, had just come out, but it took us some time to find the book because when you Googled this back in 2020, the only information that would come up was from radical activist organizations like the Trevor Project, the Human Rights Campaign, Listen. And all of these organizations would promote the lie that if you don't immediately affirm this trans identification, your child is going to commit suicide.
Yeah,
And so
the
we
the
were
line
terrified.
was would you rather have an alive son or a dead daughter? It's
That's right.
very gross in the emotional manipulation there.
That's right. And as a therapist, and even if you're not a therapist, that's enough to terrify any parent. That's a parent's worst nightmare to lose a
Mhm,
child to suicide,
mhm,
particularly, a vulnerable child. And I would have at that time put my daughter in that category. She did have difficulty making and maintaining friends. And so initially, when she fell into this middle school friend group, we were excited. We thought, finally she's found some peers that were interested in some of the same quirky books and games and things that she liked. She's a very talented artist. And so she didn't always do kind of mainstream things that most kids are into. But when school started, that's when our world fell apart because 2 weeks into the school year, my daughter got into the car and said, Mom, I had a meeting about my game today, and they asked me which restroom I wanted to use. And I had told the school that our daughter was struggling. I had told them that we thought her confusion was directly related to her friend group. And so, because I was so involved in the school district, in fact, I was volunteer of the year at this school, Jeff.
mm,
They knew me. And I was just so confused in that moment. Number one, how did they have a meeting with my daughter that I wasn't aware of, that I wasn't invited to?
mhm.
So I immediately contacted the guidance counselor and said, why are you asking my child which restroom she wants to use? This is a safety issue. And they called me back. So the assistant principal and the guidance counselor called me back because, again, parents were not allowed on campus. That's when I knew something was wrong because I had spoken to this guidance counselor many times before. So why was she
Mhm.
calling me with an assistant principal on the phone as well? And they told me in that phone call, Mrs. Littlejohn, we cannot give you any information about the meeting we had with your child. Your child is now protected by a non discrimination law.
Tell everybody what state this is in.
It was Florida.
Florida is a conservative state, isn't it?
It is, but we have short term memory loss. Back in 2020, again, nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew that this radical ideology that teaches children that they could be something that they're not born. We had no idea that this had infiltrated not only every aspect of our culture, but especially our schools. Schools were and are still ground zero for this destructive ideology. So and unfortunately, it doesn't stop there, Jeff. I didn't stop there because I still couldn't understand how legally they can meet with our 13-year-old child without our knowledge or consent. And so we continue to press.
Well, the
And
thing
our
that
only
I thought was
recourse,
worth belaboring here before you go on is there are a lot of people who want to take false comfort. They want to say, Oklahoma is a red state. There are a lot of people here would just say stuff like that. That happens in blue. If you're up in Maine, yeah, you can anticipate that. If you're in California, you can anticipate that. They don't understand that in a lot of places the legislation has already been authored so as to be hostile to them. So in Florida, that's one case. You didn't even know what was going on, and yet the legislature had already provided for cover for the school system to operate in this way. I also think it's important before you go further to establish your household was not one of these uh, kind of post-Christian. You were a believing family. You are a Christian family. Y'all are tied into a global Methodist church. And even so, I think there are some people who want to believe, oh, we're a Christian family. We pray together. We go to church on Sundays. Therefore, our children are not going to get sucked into this sort of thing. And so, whether you talk about it now or come back around to it later, I do think it's important to talk about the mechanics of how it is that even though the blood of Christ is more powerful than anything, that doesn't protect necessarily our children from bad ideas that they can get inculcated into. So, do you want to talk about that now or later?
yeah, I'll finish talking about kind of what happened with the school. And then I'm definitely going
Okay.
to come back to that because I think that that's probably one of the most important aspects of this entire talk that we're having, Jeff.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so we our only recourse was to go to the assistant superintendent, which we did. And our communication with her went back and forth for about 6 to 7 weeks. And then we were finally given an in person meeting with the principal of the middle school. And this was the first time we were shown it's called a gender support plan. It's really a social transition plan. This is an official plan created by an organization called Gender Spectrum. So anybody can look them up. But it's a 6-page document. They sat our 13-year-old daughter alone in a room with 3 adults that consisted of the assistant principal, the guidance counselor, and a social worker I had never met. And they asked her questions in this plan that went well beyond a name and pronouns. They asked her which restroom and locker room she preferred to use, which sex she preferred to room with on overnight field trips. And then they asked the child, how should we refer to you when speaking to your parents? Should we use your birth name and pronouns or your new name and pronouns? This is to effectively deceive parents that these social transitions have ever even occurred.
I've seen a thing, it came from a male teacher who said, man, it was like a TikTok. I think I saw it highlighted on Libs of TikTok. It was a male teacher, younger than me. He said, if your parents are not affirming of your gender identity, then guess what? I'm your parent now. Forget them. I'm your parent now. And I've seen recently other teachers putting that sign with those words, I'm your parent now, on their doorway to their classroom. And I think it's important to be clear. There are teachers that are not on board with this at all whatsoever, but there are teachers that are totally on board with it and very much utilizing the cover that school systems give them to re-socialize our children. My wife and I homeschool partly for this reason. It's very difficult to be vigilant enough to figure out, okay, who's your different teacher? What are they teaching you every day? Like, it's very difficult to be that vigilant because because life is demanding. But if you're not vigilant, then how long was this stuff seeping into your daughter? It was just a matter of a couple weeks, right?
No. And so, what I think it's really important is there is no safe state. And you alluded to that. In Florida, this had started back in 2016. There's an activist organization called Equality Florida, and I can guarantee where you are in Oklahoma, every state has something similar.
Mhm.
And they had partnered with this school district under the guise of anti bullying and non discrimination policies. And
Who could be
so
against bullying or anti-bullying? I mean,
that's right.
everybody's against bullying,
Nobody
right?
wants to
Everybody's
be
against non,
right.
yeah.
That's right. Can't discriminate. Don't want any kid bullied, of course. So they
Mhm.
would go into these schools and say, how best are you protecting your LGBTQ students? And so what we learned, because I did a deep dive into this shortly after that horrific meeting that we had with the middle school principal. And what we learned was this organization, Equality Florida, had infiltrated 63 out of 67 counties. And they were partnering with them, and they would give them almost checklists, very similar to how Human Rights Campaign does this to hospitals and schools as well. And they would ask them questions like, do you have an LGBTQ guide? Do you have gender support plans? Do you have safe space stickers? Do you have books in the classroom that teach children about gender identity? And so they
Mhm.
would do these things and make the schools believe that this is kind. This is important. This is how we show compassion. And kindness and compassion have been so weaponized when it comes to this issue. But I can guarantee if you see or hear the words, we are a safe school, we are an inclusive school, we are a and welcoming school, gender ideology is absolutely front and absolutely in that school, front and center.
There's so much code. Well, and this is another reason why it's just very difficult to be vigilant when your kids are going. I saw. that I'm on social media, so one comic shows a parent greeting a child as he comes home from school one day, says, how is school today, son? And the son just looks at him and then just vomits out a rainbow, because that's just the waters in which they're swimming. And it's just so hard. When you're swimming in water, you don't register that you're in water. If you're a fish, it's just what you're in. And yet, um, it's made up of stuff. And there are ideas in the water that we're swimming in that how is a child going to step outside of that and go, actually, these are new and experimental ideas that are very untried and are not natural. Kids just, this is their nature. They adapt what's around them. And to a degree, adults do too. But the lexicon we're using is so strange and foreign just compared to a few decades ago in this nation. And it's James Lindsay goes into a lot of the lexicon as well. Anything dealing with holistic health, anything dealing with social emotional learning, there are
That's
ways
right.
in which they couch it that don't sound sex, gender, ideology oriented at all, and yet are connected to this larger picture that is undergirded by all of that. And it's very difficult. I mean, how many words have we already said right in the last 2 minutes that a lot of people think sound innocuous, and who could be against that? But again, this began with an anti-bullying effort that then went all this direction, and it's manifesting not just in certain things being talked about, but
Right.
programs being designed that alienate adults from their children and eventually introduce children into, well, in Florida, is it possible to start interfering with them hormonally and put them into a consultation relationship with medical professionals?
Well, not anymore, but Jeff, at the time it was. And so that's one of the things that terrified us is when, number one, what the school did created a huge wedge between us and our child. My
Mhm,
husband and I were the only ones trying to keep her tethered to the reality of her sex. Because when you pull back the curtain from what they call gender affirming care, you are horrified to learn that they are sterilizing vulnerable children like my daughter with
mhm,
off label use of puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, and they were performing double mastectomies on girls as young as 12 years old in our country.
mhm,
And we only have right now, I think we're at 27 states that have passed legislation, Florida being one of them, that have some level of restrictions on puberty blockers, cross sex hormones, and surgical interventions on minors. But think of how many states that leads, Jeff, that are still doing this
mhm,
on children. And, not only did it create a huge wedge, you hit the nail on the head. A lot of these teachers think they know better than the parents.
right.
And when we were finally shown this LGBTQ guide that thankfully has been rescinded, and at Leon County, where we are, was not the only one that had this guide. They were all over Florida in Florida schools. And I can promise you, there are other school districts that have the same thing. In fact, Parents Defending Education, I think they estimated that there are still 26,000 school districts that have these secret social transition policies.
Mhm,
But this LGBTQ guide explicitly painted all parents to be a danger to children with no due process. And
mhm,
so one of the questions in the Q&A was, a child is exhibiting a sexual orientation or a gender identity different than their sex. Do you tell the parents? And the answer was no. Outing a child to their parents could cause abuse or make them homeless.
mhm,
And there is no evidence to back that up whatsoever. And frankly, you can't presume all parents to be a danger to their children with no due process. We have mandatory reporting laws. And so when I first started understanding what the laws were, and our legislators thankfully did act swiftly when they found out what had happened to our family and figured out that there were policies in schools allowing this type of medical intervention to happen without parent consent, they passed what we now know is the parental rights and education law. And so That's when the whole thing about the Don't Say Gay bill blew up nationally.
Mhm.
In fact, it was
Mhm.
international. But that was the first time I had ever been to my capital, where I live in Tallahassee, Florida, and started testifying for this law so that parents wouldn't be in the same situation as we were with our child. Because my daughter, Jeff, she was celebrated for this.
Mhm.
She was told she was brave. She was never told she was brave when she was a girl, which she is a
Mhm.
girl, but you know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
when she's identifying as a girl, which is exactly what she is, she
Mhm.
wasn't celebrated. She wasn't pulled aside. These kids are getting an incredible amount of attention. And think about it also, this is at a time where the parent child relationship can already be vulnerable. That's a normal kind of push pull adolescent relationship between a mom and a daughter. And so for a child to be given that much power over their parents, and for a school district, adults in that school to collude with that child to keep a psychiatric issue secret, because that's the other thing that I was just completely blown away by and caught off guard. I had no idea the field of psychology had been completely infiltrated with this lie that you only affirm these children.
Mhm.
You don't do any kind of differential diagnosis. You don't explore co occurring issues that may actually be the root cause of that distress. And so, it just really took me some time to unpack not only what was happening with my daughter, but what had happened to our entire culture.
Mhm.
And, at the same time this was happening with my family, my church was a United Methodist church. So soon after, we started the disaffiliation process because I quickly realized not only has this ideology infiltrated the psychological field, the medical field, our schools, it's infiltrated my own church. And so
Just
thankfully,
as a
we did
side
take the
note,
steps.
the way that I think most of my audience is already going to be aware of some of this. It is hard for a lot of people to understand there are long-standing moneyed interests whose sole purpose is to infiltrate and corrupt trusted institutions, including denominations. So, with the funding of the Arcus Foundation, Reconciling
Yes.
Ministries Network was commissioned to do exactly that and has done exactly that within the United Methodist Church by forming a coalition group that produces content to be used by local churches to shift the understanding of sex and gender. You saw that within the United Methodist Church. And as you're going through this disaffiliation process to get out, you're seeing this ideology as one of the many things that you're leaving behind.
Well, church should have been a safe place for us. It should be a safe place for every family dealing with this.
Mm,
And for it to be in my home life, and let me tell you, when trans ideology comes into your home, it wrecks your entire home. It
mm,
impacts every single person in that family, including the siblings. And so, oftentimes parents feel like they're walking on eggshells, and parents should be able to trust that if they bring their child to church,
mm,
that that child is going to be treated with the biblical understanding, a biblical worldview, that that child was created in God's image, male or female. No what, that can and never will change. And instead, what I was seeing in our denomination through the United Methodist Church was drag queen story hour. I was seeing them denounce that we are made in his image, male or female, that there were these 72 gender identities that we must affirm. And I couldn't believe it. It's like we felt like we were in the twilight zone, and the only people trying to protect our daughter, because again, once you pull the curtain back from where this all leads, this whole, gender affirming care, this whole medical protocol, we were terrified. Now the irreversible medical pathway our daughter was on. And she was very cavalierly talking about, getting a double mastectomy when she turns 18 and going on testosterone. She had zero idea, nor could she at age 13 and 14, as to what these interventions, number one, would do to her body. It's like putting poison in your body. But also, kids are incapable of understanding how they would feel in 10, 20 years when you're rendered infertile, when you've now allowed doctors to give you medicines, and I wouldn't even call them medications because medication should restore health, right? These only destroy health. But we're talking about taking the sexual functioning, the future sexual functioning away from children who have never even been kissed.
Mm.
That is what's happening when you're giving a child puberty blockers, which, by the way, 98% of children placed on puberty blockers, it's not a pause button like they say. They go on to cross-sex hormones. And we
Mhm.
now know, the HHS just did a systematic overview of systematic reviews that have already been done. We know that the risk outweigh the benefits. We know that Lupron, which was used to sterilize sex offenders and treat prostate cancer, is destroying bone density of these children. Because you're not just stopping secondary sex characteristics, you're stopping and brain development.
Mm.
And so we found ourselves in a nightmare that we didn't know how to get out of. And without relying on Jesus and following the will of God,
Mhm.
there's no way we could have rescued our daughter.
Ground that we've already tread over, but I think is important to specify for the audience or state. Um, there have always been, okay, so a universal condition of humanity is feeling alienated from self. There are thousands of years of human history of individuals writing about this experience. And then it gets expressed in different ways throughout history by different cultures. Um, Up until recently, the tomboy was a known phenomenon. Girls that just weren't in touch with their femininity yet, and maybe even very uncomfortable with it. There are a lot of people who think that the tomboy is now being removed from society by the rise of trans ideology. There've also been a number of gay people who've spoken up publicly and saying gay people are being erased by trans stuff because it's dealing with these very outdated modes of gender norms and just saying, well, if your boy enjoys playing with Barbies, well, guess what? He's a girl. Is there
True.
anything more regressive than that? According to their own ideology. I mean, the thing becomes ridiculous quite quickly. But I've found myself particularly, it makes sense to me. There have always been societal crazes, mass formation psychosis, um, uh, contagions. I remember when I was a kid, it was bulimia. There were a ton of pubescent girls around that age who participate in a self-destructive behavior, or like cutting was the thing a few years ago. And this is just something that, young girls are wonderful. I got girls that are going to be teenagers soon, God help me. But there are certain weaknesses, or maybe weakness isn't a right word. There's a risk that comes with everything. There, nobody is perfect, and when you're going to be escorting young people through life, there's certain things you need to be aware of, and one of the things you need to be aware of when dealing with young people, um, I'm not going to say that you believe this, but what I'm going to tell my kids is, y'all are stupid. You don't know what you're doing. Listen to me. You're going to experience things that are not real. These feelings feel very real to you. They are not real. So I'm going to teach you self denial. I'm going to teach you what the Bible says. And what you'll find over time is that stuff is true and your feelings are not true. But that goes really against the grain of everything we teach kids in our culture. This is one of those things that's highlighting something that Methodists in particular have been very uncomfortable with, which is that the Christian faith is an otherworldly, weird, peculiar faith. We don't fit in with the world. Our children are going to look different from the world. They're going to be transing their kids. We're going to be loving ours to receive the bodies that God has given them. And it don't fit
Yeah.
together.
Well, and Jeff, we as a body shouldn't be uncomfortable with biblical truth.
Right.
We can't be. And I think too many pastors have stayed on the sidelines of this. And I don't quite understand why, because this is not a hard one. It's very simple when you're following what the Bible tells us God made us in his image, male or female, and all children should be taught that early and often so that we could fully inoculate these kids from this ideology altogether because you can't protect them. You know, you brought up your daughters, and I think
Mhm.
girls in particular, and Abigail Schreier talked about this, girls in particular are vulnerable to social contagions of all types because of the way they socialize. And so you're exactly right. I saw orders, when I was growing up. Unfortunately, self-harm is still somewhat of a social contagion. And then you throw in social media that's glamorizing these things. It's
Mhm.
normalizing these things. Abigail Schreier wrote a follow-up book to Irreversible Damage called Bad Therapy, which I
Mhm.
highly recommend because what's happening is normal adolescence is being pathologized. And instead of these girls being told, puberty's hard, nobody likes it. It really stinks, but guess what? You're going to get through it. They're being told if you're uncomfortable with your developing body, it may be because you're trans.
Mhm.
That's a horrible message to be sending any child. And you brought up teachers. There is a power differential there. Children, particularly young children, trust teachers. And when
Mhm.
you have activist teachers that have fully embraced the lies of gender identity ideology, they are absolutely indoctrinating your children with the same lie. The other thing that I warn parents about is even if your child is not particularly vulnerable to thinking that they are transgender themselves, they are being trained to be an ally. And that is just as dangerous to me because you're still being required to buy into the lie. And
Mhm.
I'm so glad that you brought up James Lindsay. He's actually a dear friend. There are so many ways that this ideology is infiltrating schools, particularly community schools. If you're in California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and you hear the term community school, that's the whole child whole model that you were talking about. These schools actually have medical clinics on their school campuses. And so when you have this entity that buys into this notion that all children should explore their gender identity and they get to choose, and there's 72 gender identities to
Mhm.
choose from, and we must affirm whatever they say. That is a recipe for disaster. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, a lot of states have laws where children can make medical decisions without parent consent. And we even still have issues in Florida. We're not perfect, and we're pretty darn close. I'll tell you that. I'm very grateful to live in a state where our governor and our legislature took swift action. But I don't know if you're aware of this, but all over the country, parents are being cut out of online medical portals starting between age 12 and 13. And the reason is, even here in Florida, adolescents can access oral contraceptives, STD treatment, and testing without parent consent. So my chart uses that small exception, which I don't even think that that should have ever happened in the first place, but they
Right.
use this exception to then blanketly cut out parents from all the medical portals. And this happened to me firsthand at Shands Hospital. It's a wonderful teaching hospital in Gainesville. They told my 12-year-old son, in order for your mom to have access to your biopsy results, you have to sign this medical proxy form. Where else on earth would that be legal for a child to sign any kind of binding legal contract that would give their parent access? So I just want your audience to understand that parental rights in our country, there has been a steady erosion for a very, very long time. So it's not just our schools that you have to be vigilant in. It's your doctor's office. It's even your dentist. It's your dermatologist. Because I tell you, these intake forms, oftentimes when they're handing your child an iPad and saying, we need you to fill out a couple of questions to get started. Oftentimes there are questions on those forms about gender identity, How do you identify? They'll use activist terms like sex assigned at birth. Sex is not assigned at birth, it's observed at birth. And so a lot of these things people just take for granted. Parents don't realize the harm. Even when you're asking a child, what are your pronouns?
Mhm.
You are sending a clear message to that child that your outside may not match your inside. Because
Right.
when you try to push someone, well, what does it mean that a child is transgender? What does that mean? It always goes back to exactly what you said, these archaic gender stereotypes. Because what gender identity is, and now we have all of these laws, hopefully, that the Trump administration is going to back out. We have all of these laws codifying this term, gender identity, into our laws. And no one has ever been asked to define it. Because you know why? It can't be a feeling of gender. We're 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 protecting someone's feeling of gender. I mean, think about that. And this is also why we're seeing now this war on biological reality, because you cannot
Mhm.
have laws like Title IX that protect sex-based rights, but also protect gender identity. And this is the kind of war that we've seen. And I think that the males in female sports, people had such a visceral reaction because it's so grossly unfair. And that really, I think, was a wake up point because people didn't have as hard a time saying, you know what, that's wrong. Leah Thomas is a male. That is clearly unfair. But when you talk about seeing a child that is now being put on this medical pathway, we are conditioned to trust doctors. We assume falsely that this medical protocol that they were pushing on these children and on the parents was based in evidence. It is not. There is no evidence to back these irreversible and harmful medical interventions they are doing to these confused children. And I will tell you, Jeff, my daughter's gender identity, which again, I believe is the biggest lie to come out of my profession, it changed 4 times in 2 years. These kids are confused. And do you know what the natural remedy to all of this distress is? Puberty. The vast majority of these kids will desist in their identification. They will accept their natal bodies as they are if
Mhm.
they're allowed to go through puberty. You set healthy boundaries for your child. You break them away from the trans influencers. You repair the relationship and trust with your child. That's why what you're doing with your girls is so important. There's two that I highly recommend. One is by Dr. Leonard Sachs called The Collapse of Parenting.
Mm.
We have abdicated our role as parents to the experts, and we
Mhm.
cannot do that anymore. We have to be the experts of our children. And the other one is hold on to your children. For so long, we were told that, oh, it's normal for teenagers to break away. Let me tell you, if you are not speaking truth and you are not the authoritative figure in your children's lives, telling them what's true and not true, someone else will be, and
Mhm.
likely they will not hold a biblical worldview.
When I was in high school, there was a predatory teacher that took me under his wing. It didn't go as far as it did with other students, but this is a reality. I was inculcated from a young age to think that my family was lame. It's lame to stay home with your family. It's lame to love your family. My wife and I are raising our kids very differently from how we were. We love family time at home. Now, granted, they haven't hit puberty yet, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying. The only way out is through, and every other tactic to try and avoid is only going to prolong misery and cause a lot of additional misery all the way. But yeah, this is something that parents of young children need to be prepared for, especially if you're going to have them in public school. And I really appreciate you bringing it home to this, so I don't have to sound as radical. But we have seen in the field of psychology, public health, public education, and even the church, as you've talked about, massive betrayal, a failure of nerve on the part of those in authority, whether they're complicit in it or just silent in the face of it. We've seen very few willing to stand up and speak up. And that's meant that the ones who do have to shriek all the louder, and then they're easily gaslighted or written off. But the reality is, the children are not okay. Things are not going well. There needs to be a rapid, a huge correction, and that's part of what you're doing here. That's what hopefully I'm helping you do. And so, specifically in the church, I don't think anybody wants pastors to get up and start spouting gender ideology and spending, the whole 30 minutes on Sunday just saying, here's what you need to believe about sex. But is that what's required at this point? What do you think?
Well, I think we have to be creative, right? This has infiltrated not only social media, but their movies. You can't watch even children's programming. Disney's a prime example without
Hmm.
seeing this pseudoscientific nonsense. And so we have to fully inoculate kids because I can tell you what this ideology does. Not only does it teach them that they can be born wrong, but it puts them at war with their bodies. It forces them to disassociate from their body parts that they don't want. Many of these kids simply see themselves as like almost like Lego pieces that they can just subtract, body parts that make them feel uncomfortable. And
Hmm.
so we, as the church and as parents, have to celebrate adolescence. We have to celebrate the man or woman that they're going to become, particularly the women. And so we have to celebrate girlhood. We need to be speaking truth into them early and often. I would highly recommend children's programming to have, story hour that's going to combat the kind of nonsense books that are in public school. And I will tell you, charter and private schools, they are not safe either, Jeff.
Yeah.
They are not safe either. Anytime you have, this DEI initiative, and there have been private Christian schools, particularly Catholic schools, that have taken this route.
Hmm.
Anytime you see DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, you better believe gender identity ideology is a part of that. And so you cannot take that for granted. And so there are many children's books now, like Elephants Are Not Birds. God made me a girl. God made me a boy. He is he. She is he. We should be reading these books to young children. And then as they get older, then you can have, broader conversations. But I put my money in where my mouth is. In 2020, when I realized how bad this was, not only was my child being impacted, but I was worried about the social contagion aspect. So I started
Right.
volunteering in our youth ministry. Because if I'm telling parents you need to be inoculating your children, number one, I wanted to keep a pulse on what was happening because we did end up pulling our children from public school. There's no way my daughter would have come out of this identity crisis without doing that and getting her away from those influences.
Good for you.
But I'm a small group leader for middle school girls. And I have such a heart for that because that really is such a vulnerable time for these girls where,
Yeah.
like I said, an identity crisis is nothing new. But we need to be honest with these children and adolescents about you are going to see some kids that are confused.
Oh, yeah.
And we need to be approaching them from a place of love and compassion. But the compassionate thing to do is to tell them the truth and to show them the love of Jesus. And just the opposite is happening in the public schools. They're telling the kids the only kind and compassionate thing to do is to affirm the lie. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I have even seen some prominent, supposedly Christian leaders saying the same thing,
Yeah.
telling parents, you must affirm this. That's meeting them where they're at. Absolutely not. You can meet someone where they're at without lying to them because lying only prolongs the identity. And there's a wonderful bonus feature of a documentary called In His Image. Laura Beth Perry is a detransitioner. She got married, so her name is now Laura Smaltz. But I'll never forget, in the really tough times when, frankly, I just wanted to give up. Laura said in that documentary bonus feature, she said, when you get tired of living the lie, you don't turn to those who were willing to lie to you. You turn
Hmm.
to those who were willing to tell you the truth, no matter how hard it was. And I clung to those words. And that, the arc of these false identities is about 5 to 7 years for most young adults especially. And there's a reason for that. It's because that's when their brains are finally fully mature.
Mm,
And think about the kind of cognitive dissonance these young adults and adolescents have through to realize not only was this all a lie, but now I have irreversibly harmed my body.
mhm.
And there's no coming back from that. So not only should we be protecting young people from going down this pathway, we as the church body must be ready to accept these detransitioners and show them the love of Jesus, because I feel like that is the only true healing that can happen. And what I see as not just a parent who's been through this, but as a counselor, is even when these kids detransition, even when these young adults detransition, they are not out of the woods, because whatever that core issue was, whether
Mhm.
it was trauma, low self-esteem, whatever that true root of the distress was, if it is not fully healed, they will continue to go to other maladaptive coping mechanisms like drugs and alcohol, like cutting, like eating disorders, until they find true healing, which I believe is only through Jesus.
Well, and you're not going to get any disagreement from me. I am going to preach a little bit, though, and kind of get off the political thing, because where we're at right now in the West is we've spent a lot of time flirting with heresy, and we need to come back to core basic doctrinal truths, and especially in the Global Methodist Church, where we're trying to reclaim Wesleyanism, a fundamental doctrine. It's total depravity. Not just confessing original sin, but all of us are born maybe with the right body. I mean, we're not talking about that. We're inclined towards sin, and that continually. None of us is born perfect. We're all messed up. We all need a supernatural action from the Holy Spirit to restore us into the new man in Christ. And that's the underlying condition that the church in particular is established to deal with. And then it can manifest in all these different directions. But if one has not understood that they are fundamentally warped in their inmost parts, life is not about having the right surgeries and hormonal interventions. Life is about forsaking ourselves and dying to self and living for Christ. And it's only there that we find any true joy or happiness. We cannot give that to ourselves. No medication can supply that. No surgical operation can supply that. No friend group can supply that. Nothing can supply that. All of us have a God shaped hole that can only be
That's right.
filled by Jesus. And until that gets proclaimed from our pulpits, we're going to continue hopping on every new fad, thinking that it's going to do what every fad before couldn't do. The definition of crazy is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. The only thing that has ever filled that God shaped hole is God. And there
Right.
is no way around, just through. And so,
Yeah.
I've really appreciated voices like Matt Walsh, who did What is a Woman, showed just how silly it is to try and define these terms that are self-referential. And I was surprised you didn't bring up his book on the walrus as one of these books of it's a children's book helping them to
Yes.
own their
Johnny the Walrus.
ideology. Yeah.
Yeah.
And got put on a list of one of the best LGBTQ books ever sold before they realized what it was. So the thing that I want parents in particular to understand while they're listening to you, and I think you'll agree with me having listened to you this whole time, we cannot phone in our job as parents. We cannot trust parents. You can't even trust preachers. As a preacher, I'm saying this. You cannot trust anyone to parent your child instead of you. You have to be a hands-on parent. You'd have to not only build that relationship, but retain that relationship. If you think your life is about a career, about having some life outside of your household, your number one responsibility outside of your relationship with Jesus is your relationship with your kid. And if you're outsourcing that to anybody else, you're negligent. And you're not only hurting your kid, but all the other ways that this spins out, they are your responsibility. And so step up. And the church
Yeah.
should be a place where we're helping parents step up rather than trying to do their job for them.
Well, and giving them tools, Jeff. And you just said you hit something on the head that I tell parents a lot, and they don't want to hear it because, again, when this happens to your family, oftentimes you're frozen in fear. You don't know what to do. And when our culture is telling us to only affirm, that if you don't affirm, your child's going to commit suicide, that's a
Mhm.
such a manipulative message to be telling parents. It's emotional blackmail, and frankly, it's a lie. But you cannot outsource this issue. You can't outsource it to your youth pastor. You can't outsource it, especially to a counselor, because depending upon what state you're in, some counselors are being told that it is quote unquote conversion therapy to help a patient feel comfortable in their God given body.
Mhm.
And so it's going to take a complete shift in culture and a change in laws to fully undo the damage that gender identity ideology has actually done. But you're exactly right. You cannot outsource this issue. However, churches do have a huge role to play. And you talked about that God-shaped hole. That's not enough to say. This has to be very explicit. So you asked the question, should they be preaching this from the pulpit? Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Not maybe not every week, but don't shy away from it. And
Mhm.
Timothy Tennant wrote a book called For the Body.
Oh, yeah.
And I was very blessed to have done an 8-week series. God continued to put me into these situations. So at the height of my daughter's confusion, my church decided to do an 8-week study on For the Body. And so God just continued to equip me with where I didn't have the knowledge to help my child and to help others. But I loved what Timothy talked about in that book is our position is always from a place of biblical truth, but our posture is always from a place of love.
Mm.
And so it's a lie that we can't do both. We absolutely can and should be doing both because the kindest, most loving thing you can do for a confused person is to sit with them and tell them the truth. Sit with them in those hard moments and say, you may not want to hear this right now, but I'm going to tell you the truth because I love you enough to do that.
Mm.
That is real love. And so that's one of the reasons I helped to co-author the Church Transgender Response Guide. I wanted churches to be equipped with what is this? A lot of parents still don't fully understand what is a GSA club? What is social emotional learning? How is this being taught in our schools? What is gender ideology? You hear these buzzwords, but until you see these different gender identities listed and
Mhm.
how they're being promoted and marketed and celebrated to children, you don't fully grasp. One of the things that we have in the guide is the gender unicorn. This is like a bubbly cartoon unicorn that's used to indoctrinate children into false belief system as young as 5 years old.
Mm.
And so parents, this guide is really important for parents and pastors, not just to understand what's being taught, but to also understand what are the laws. Because sometimes they get scared about, well, I have a trans identified girl that's telling me she's a boy. Do I allow her to go with the boys or can I legally keep her with the girls?
Mm.
Do I have to allow her to use the male restroom? All these kind of questions. This ideology, on top of destroying families and children's bodies, it has created so much chaos. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what the enemy designed it for, right?
Exactly, yeah.
To
Yeah.
create chaos, to,
Mhm.
to speak lies into children, to make them hate their bodies, to make them hate their families for not affirming the lie. And
Mhm.
that's what we're dealing with. And so the guide talks about what is gender identity ideology, how
Yeah,
to
I'm gonna show it
protect
on the
and
screen.
safeguard.
She's referring to a guide. We'll make it available in the show notes here. The Church Transgender Response Guide. You said you were a co-author in this, and then
Yes,
it's a lengthy document. Here's a table of contents. If anybody's watching this, you can see the different chapters. This is really aimed at comprehensively equipping not just parents but religious leaders as well, right?
that's exactly right. We want churches to get off the sidelines because I can tell you firsthand, a lot of the Christian parents that I help that are undergoing this nightmare with their children, they feel completely abandoned by the church because the church should be warning parents about this. Thankfully, my church has allowed me to have shops with parents where I show them this is what your child is going to be exposed to, and this is how you need to be protecting your child from the lies that they're going to hear. And so, oftentimes you almost have to give parents a script. Here's what you say. I give my middle school girls a script because they ask me, Miss January, what do we do if someone wants us to call them by a different name? These kids need to be told how to handle these real world situations that they're going to encounter from a place of biblical truth, but also love and compassion.
There was a you, these concepts are really hard because yes, love and compassion, but also it's compassion that's resulted in us getting so warped. It's a disjointed overemphasis on compassion over truth. And so I interviewed Joe Rigney a couple months ago. He wrote a book called The Sin of Empathy, which he
Mm.
acknowledges, empathy is a required part of the Christian faith, but whenever it's not kept in balance with truth, it really warps us. And that's the situation that modern day Christians are in. For so much of history, we have been the empathetic ones. We have been the ones correcting a very harsh, draconian society and caring for the poor and caring for the least of these. We find ourselves in which that has been actually weaponized to destabilize society. And we, for the sake of stability, for the sake of truth, for the sake of true health, are in the position of sounding mean, but speaking from a deeper kind of love that's really quite alien to the world. And that's a very difficult line for most of us to walk when we haven't been equipped for it. And church, for so many people, the church is well, you said it, it should be a safe place. But what they mean by that is a place where we don't talk about hard things, where we don't have to feel things that make us uncomfortable, where we don't have to question our political loyalties or the way that we've been parenting our children so far. And this really is a place where the mainline tradition, at least in the Global Methodist Church, I think we're leaving the mainline tradition behind. That's a tradition that doesn't talk about hard things or go hard places. I think we're going back to a way of life that's countercultural, that's pushing back against the culture, that's really pushing people to be better than they want to be, holier than they naturally want to be. And if they're not interested in that, if they are really okay with sacrificing their children on this altar of LGBTQ identity or ideology, whatever you want to say, that they probably don't belong in the church. And so I've wondered if there's a kind of legislation or resolution that I can present to the Global Methodist General Conference next year that would make clear that at least this covenant body of people who call themselves Global Methodists are going to have a firm public stand against this ideology. Are you aware of any religious bodies, denominations, or covenant bodies doing anything along those lines, or has it been mostly just kind of implicit along certain conservative strains?
That's not really my forte, but I would love
Right.
to be a part of something like that if that's what, I definitely think that's the direction we should go. We have to have a strong biblical stance on this issue because when the church starts to be a reflection of what's happening in the culture, something has gone terribly wrong. And
Right.
you brought up being comfortable. I think that that's a huge mistake to believe that we shouldn't make our congregation uncomfortable.
Mhm.
To be a Christian is uncomfortable in today's time, and it should be uncomfortable because we are called to lay down our lives, die to sin, and pick up our cross to follow Jesus. It's not supposed to be easy.
Right.
And I can tell you, up until this crisis with my family, I was not the Christ follower I am today.
Mm.
Sometimes things happen in your family that draw you closer and nearer to Christ because he wants you to be completely dependent on him. And so, my call to family is not only to get right with your family and repair any kind of mistrust or relationship with your children. Don't be
Mhm.
complacent with your relationship with Christ either.
Right.
Because if you are not actively teaching your child to find their identity in Christ, they will have an identity crisis of something. I
Mm.
don't know what that will be for your child, but I see it happen in other families that may not be trans ideology, but it's going to be something else.
Yeah.
And so it's just really important that parents not abdicate their role, but that churches also not abdicate their role either. And their role is to be the light in the darkness in a community,
Yeah.
the truth on the hill, the light on the hill that can't be extinguished. And, Jeff, that's one of the main reasons I went public with what happened to my family. I had never intended to go public. I never intended to file a federal lawsuit and our family in this kind of light. But darkness breeds without light.
Mm,
And the only way to extinguish darkness is to put light on it.
yeah,
And so once my family made the choice, because that's what God placed on our heart, to bring this into the light, courage is contagious.
yeah,
And I can tell you, churches need not be scared of speaking truth on this issue. The vast majority of Americans believe this is insane. We
yeah,
should not be sterilizing vulnerable children, that of course children don't have the maturity or the brain development to make these kind of irreversible decisions. Of course we shouldn't be cutting off the healthy body parts of kids or even young adults, because personally, if it's bad medicine for a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old, it's not magically good medicine for an 18-year-old. And one thing that I don't think churches and parents know, there is no safeguarding anymore when it comes to this issue. An 18-year-old can walk into Planned Parenthood and get estrogen or testosterone after 30 minutes.
yeah,
They don't care what happens to these patients. They don't care that the testosterone is going to atrophy the female organs. They do not care what happens to these patients.
yeah.
And it's just causing so much destruction, not just to the person's body, but to the families. Because the kids are being told, if your parents don't affirm you, they don't love you. And
Mhm,
you'll find your new family. You'll find your glitter family. You brought up the I'm your parent now. That is
mhm,
real. I have known
mhm,
parents that have lost their children to what they call glitter families.
mm,
And we even have situations now where Child Protective Services is taking children from
mhm,
loving parents for simply not affirming them in these trans identification.
mhm. Yeah, this is the thing before us right now at this moment in the United States of America. This is the situation, and we're not saying it's the same everywhere. What we are saying is this is insidious. It's been funded. The groundwork has been laid for a long time. There are
Yes.
many moneyed, well-positioned entities that still have a lot of influence that are operating in the dark, and right now, we need to give up on whatever project this was that we embraced as a society where we just trusted other people with our kids, where we outsourced that responsibility. We need to take responsibility for ourselves, first off, which is a big enough problem, but then for our kids as well. And for those who don't, I mean, here's the real unfair thing about it: upper middle class people of resources, of means, can do that. What we're seeing right now is that the main ones that get preyed on are going to be people from single mother households, lower income households, people from low IQ households, people who are not well positioned and resourced. So this is not something, I don't think, where it's first and foremost self and kids, but after that, it's not enough just to have the right stance for us personally. We need to have a social stance. We need to be speaking loudly about this. We need to be engaged. I think faith is political. I think we need to be behind, and I don't think it's as simple as, oh, I'm a Republican, I'm on the right side. How did this stuff even get approved in the first place without several Republican leaders being on board? This is something that requires people to stop watching TV or Netflix and actually read your workbook, actually talk with other people in Sunday school about it, actually
That's
learn
right.
what's going on in the legislature and how it is that they can protect other people's children as well as their own. And if we refuse to do that, then it's going to be on us when we look around in 15 years and we do not have a functional class of adults to even keep the economy going. This is destabilizing, not just in the sex world,
Yes.
but in families. This is alienating
Yes.
parents from children. This is alienating individuals from self. There are some like Chloe Cole, if you're going to talk about
Right.
a detransitioner who's able to kind of come out of that and achieve some kind of semblance of wholeness. But that's an exceptional person right there. Most
Right.
spend the rest of their lives broken, traumatized, not knowing up from down. And then it's really put to the church right now. Are we going to do anything about it at all? Do we have anything to say at all? And then we have, I appreciate you very much for being a person saying we do have something to say and we
That's
should
right.
say it. And
And we have
I
an obligation to say it because, you also just said something that's so profound. It's destabilizing. It's not just destabilizing that child when they're
right.
exposed to this ideology, it's destabilizing our church, it's destabilizing our society.
That's right.
This is a society ending ideology.
Yeah.
And I'll do evil is patient. This has been boiling underground for a long time, and it's come to a head finally. I'm so grateful that it's in the light. But parents and pastors who wrongly believe this won't impact me, this won't impact my church, this won't impact my family,
Mhm.
they are wrong. They are wrong. And I just pray that people wake up and speaking out before it's too late. And you don't have to do what you're doing. You don't have to have a podcast. You
Oh,
don't have
yeah.
to do what I'm doing with interviews or filing a lawsuit. You can simply have conversations.
Mhm.
You can start teaching Sunday school. You can become a youth leader. You can run a small group for parents that have questions about this. Do a study on Timothy Tennant's book. Do what you can do that's with your skill set. Because I think a lot of Americans think, oh, well, this is not an issue anymore because Trump won. But let me tell you something. This issue should have never been politicized. And because it's been so politicized in our country, the evidence is not leading when it should. And I can also tell you this ideology does not discriminate. The vast majority of parents that I help are on the left. They consider themselves liberal, many of them lifelong Democrats. And so this is not a political issue for them. This is a biblical issue. And we must speak out on biblical issues, especially when it comes to the safety and wellness of our children. This is a fundamental truth that they should understand from a very early age.
And that bears repeating. We've been having a kind of hybrid conversation about stats, figures, medicine. Yes, Lupron is chemical castration. It's used in sex offenders. Yes, all kinds of mental health implications are here. But even more fundamentally than that, there's this thing called objective truth. There is this one called the Lord of heaven and earth. There's this thing called the Bible, which is his word, entirely reliable. And things really are this clear. Even if there weren't all these health outcomes that we could point to, it would still be as plain and clear as it is today. It just so happens that the God of heaven and earth has told us how we're built, how we're meant to be. And when we abandon that, things go wrong. And so as things continue to go wrong, are we going to wake up? Are we going to speak the truth in love? Or are we going to continue forward in our delusion? And at least for right now, January, Littlejohn, you're on the side of let's wake up. Let's speak the truth in love. And I appreciate your clarion call for that. Was there anything else you hope to convey to the people who tuned in for this before we conclude our time together?
Well, just if you are a parent that finds yourself in this situation, just know that you're not alone, that there is hope. There are thousands of parents finding success with walking their children through this confusion. It is not easy. I don't wish this on any family, but it is possible. And so I would just encourage you to lead with love and get in touch with me. I will connect you to resources that I wish I would have had. Thankfully, we have made so much progress in the last 4 years. And not only, do we have truth on our side, but the majority of Americans believe this is nonsense. This is pseudoscience. We need help changing the culture. A lot of people just want to move on for this. They want it to be over. It's not over. I get contacted weekly by parents still waking up to this nightmare. So if we had collectively come together as a body of Christ and said, no, this is not true, years ago, we wouldn't be here. And so now we have to play cleanup. And it's going to take all hands on deck. You said something earlier that really resonates with me. I believe silence is complicity,
Mm,
and we cannot afford to be silent on this issue.
mm. There is no way around except through. And those who are listening, we got to go through. This is not a time for denial or avoidance. This is a time for sober living in the world. So I'm going to figure out either I'm going to put it on my Google Drive and have a link to it, or I'll provide a link to the workbook that Miss Littlejohn has made available to you, for you and your church. If you haven't already, to find your voice in this and to take your stand in this. And stay tuned to this. Don't just move on and go, okay, well, this is just one more issue. If you care about children, if you care about the church fulfilling its role in our country and in our world, this is something worth sinking your teeth into and praying about. And so to that end, I'm going to turn back to Mrs. Littlejohn. Would you say a prayer for those who spent their time with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will tell you where to find the guide. It's childparentrights.org under
Great.
resources. And so there's a lot of resources there created by not just me, but a pastor that specializes in this issue as well as my attorneys. So
Mm,
that's where you can find that. But thank you so much
perfect.
for having me, and I'd love to pray.
Yes.
Father God, we just come humbly before you. Thank you, Lord. I thank you for the truth that you spoke into me and through me, Lord. I thank you for never giving up on us. I thank you for being our perfect Redeemer, God. I thank you for saving not only my daughter, but thousands of children from the throes of this confusion, God. And I just pray over any parent who is in this situation. Please give them strength to continue to speak truth to their child, Lord. And I also praise you for the amazing prodigal sons and daughters who have returned home. And these are children, Lord, that were so lost. And so I just praise you that we have hope, but we only have hope in you. And I thank you for your word. I thank you for creating us whole, male and female, in your image, God, and just help us to have the clarity and the courage to speak truth in every person that we meet, in our churches, and just give these pastors the courage to come out against this radical ideology, Lord, this evil ideology that is destroying children and destroying so many of our families, God. I thank you. I thank you for people like Jeff who are courageous in being truth tellers and getting this information out to the world. And I just pray over our country, Lord. I pray over our leaders, and I pray for complete healing so that we can all trust in you and just spark a revival in this country. It's in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. January Littlejohn, thank you so much